I can't hear the truck behind me, but I can feel it screaming toward the flames, and I'm not letting go of that man. Hannah Carter didn't think. She didn't calculate the odds of a fuel tanker detonating 12 feet from where she knelt. She only felt the road trembling under her palms, the heat pressing against her face like an open oven door, and the stranger's body going slack beneath her hands as she dragged him inch by inch away from a wall of fire that was about to swallow them both. Before you find out what happened in the next 60 seconds and why the man she saved would change her life forever, subscribe to this channel and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to the moment everything began. The mountains outside Missoula, Montana had a particular kind of silence in late October, the kind that settled over the pine ridges like a held breath. Hannah Carter always noticed it more than most people did because for her silence wasn't something she chose. It was something she lived inside permanently since she was 7 years old, and a childhood fever had taken her hearing and never given it back. She was 22 now, driving her secondhand Honda Civic down Route 93 with the windows cracked, not because she needed the air, but because she liked the way it moved the hair against her neck. It was one of the small sensations that reminded her she was still connected to the world, even if the world came to her filtered through vibration light and the shapes people's mouths made when they spoke. Today had not been a good day. She'd spent the morning in a sterile office in Kalispell, watching a doctor's lips move slowly and deliberately so she could read them, watching him write numbers on a notepad because the interpreter had canceled last minute and neither of them wanted to wait another 3 weeks for a rescheduled appointment. The numbers were the kind that made her stomach drop. $87,000. That was the number. That was what it would cost to fix the degenerative nerve damage creeping through her inner ear and vestibular system, damage that hadn't just taken her hearing all those years ago, but was now slowly, cruelly coming for her balance too. Without the surgery, doctors couldn't say for certain how much longer she'd be able to walk without a cane, without falling, without her whole world tilting sideways for no reason at all. She had $11,000 saved. She taught art 3 days a week at a school for deaf children in Missoula, and it was work she loved with her whole chest. Work that felt like purpose, but it was not work that paid $87,000 for anything, let alone a surgery insurance had already denied twice. Hannah gripped the steering wheel and let herself cry for exactly 4 minutes because that was the rule she'd made for herself years ago. 4 minutes to feel sorry for the unfairness of it. Then she wiped her face, checked her mirrors out of habit. She checked mirrors more than hearing people did because sound never warned her of anything, and kept driving. She didn't know yet that in less than 10 minutes, none of the $87,000 would matter at all. Not because it would disappear, but because she was about to walk into fire. The first sign was the birds. Hannah couldn't hear the impact, the shriek of metal. The horn that witnesses would later say blared for a full 3 seconds before cutting off the awful percussive boom of 2 vehicles meeting at combined speeds of nearly 110 miles an hour. But she saw the birds. A great dark cloud of them exploded up out of the tree line half a mile ahead, startled into flight all at once, the way birds only scatter when something violent has just happened beneath them. Then she saw the smoke. It didn't rise gently. It punched upward, black and thick, rolling into the pale Montana sky like something alive and furious. Hannah's foot came off the gas before her mind had even finished processing what her eyes were telling her. She came around the bend, and the road ahead was chaos. A semi-truck lay jackknifed across both lanes, its trailer crumpled like a soda can. Beside it on its side, a fuel tanker hissed and shuddered, already licked with small tongues of orange flame along one seam. 3 other cars had stopped at a safe distance, their drivers standing outside them, frozen phones raised, mouths open in shapes Hannah recognized even without sound. Shapes that meant screaming shapes. That meant, oh my God, shapes. That meant somebody help him. Somebody help him. Why isn't anybody helping him? Hannah pulled her car onto the shoulder and got out before she'd even decided to. That was the thing about Hannah Carter that people who knew her well understood, and people who didn't know her yet were about to learn. She didn't experience fear and hesitation the way other people did. Not because she was fearless, she felt fear plenty, but her whole life had trained her to act first and process the terror afterward, because in a hearing world that so often forgot she existed, hesitation had never once helped her. Waiting for someone else to notice her, to help her, to include her, it had cost her too many times. She learned instead to move. She ran toward the wreck, A man near the stopped cars grabbed her arm as she passed, his mouth working frantically, and she caught only fragments, too dangerous going to blow. Get back. But she twisted free because past his shoulder, past the flames now crawling up the side of the tanker, she had seen something none of the other bystanders seemed to have noticed yet. A hand, sticking out from beneath the crushed cab of the semi-truck. Moving. Barely, but moving. Hannah's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat. She didn't have words for what came over her in that moment, not fully, not even years later when people asked her to explain it. All she would ever be able to say was, "This somebody is dying 20 feet from me, and I am the only one running toward him instead of away." The heat hit her first, a physical wall that made her eyes water and her skin scream in protest. She dropped to her knees in the gravel and grease and broken glass and army crawled beneath the mangled edge of the cab toward the man she could now see. A large man, gray-bearded, blood running down one side of his face, pinned at the shoulder by a twisted piece of the dashboard. His eyes were closed. His lips were moving, but Hannah couldn't tell if he was speaking or simply groaning in pain, and there was no time to figure out which. She grabbed the piece of metal, pinning his shoulder, and pulled. It didn't move. She felt heat intensify against her back. Even without hearing the roar of the flames climbing higher on the tanker, she felt the temperature change like a hand pressing down on her spine, and some instinct screamed at her that she had seconds, not minutes. She braced her boots against the crumpled door frame and threw her whole body weight backward, pulling the twisted metal with everything she had. And something gave, not enough, not fully, but enough. And the man's shoulder slipped free. With a wet, terrible sound she felt more than heard. He was heavier than anyone she had ever tried to move in her life. 220 pounds of dead weight, unconscious blood slicking her hands as she hooked her arms beneath his and began to drag. Later, when investigators reconstructed the timeline from bystander footage, they would determine that Hannah Carter had 11 seconds between the moment she pulled the man free and the moment the fuel tanker's compromised seam finally gave way entirely. She used every one of them. She dug her heels into the gravel and pulled screaming from the effort, though she couldn't hear her own voice dragging the stranger's body across broken asphalt, one desperate heave at a time, his boots scraping his head, lolling against her shoulder, and she did not stop, did not slow down, did not once consider letting go, even as her lungs burned from the smoke and her palms tore open on the pavement. 6 feet, 10 feet, 15. The world went white. Hannah didn't hear the explosion. She would never hear anything ever again that had already been true for 15 years. But she felt it in a way that no hearing person could have described, a wave of pressure that lifted her clean off the ground and hurled her and the stranger both across the shoulder of the road like they weighed nothing at all. Everything went dark. When Hannah's eyes opened again, the world came back to her in pieces. First the skiaze, gray-wide and different, exactly where it had been before, as if nothing had happened at all. Then pain, a deep singing pain along her left side, her palms raw and bleeding, her ears useless as they already were ringing with a phantom pressure that made her head throb. Then motion, blurred shapes moving around her, mouths opening and closing, hands on her shoulders, her arms gently but urgently, and Hannah realized distantly that these were paramedics, that time had passed, that she was being lifted onto a gurney. She turned her head, searching, and found him. The stranger she'd pulled from the fire lay on a second gurney 6 feet away, an oxygen mask over his face, his gray beard singed at one edge, his leather vest. She noticed it now, for the first time, thick black leather, a patch on the chest. She couldn't quite make out from this angle, torn and scorched, but somehow still on him. His eyes opened. For just a moment, across the chaos of the accident scene, across the gap between two gurneys being loaded into two different ambulances, Hannah Carter and the stranger looked directly at each other. His lips moved. She caught only one word clear enough to read even through the haze of her own pain. "Thank you." Then the ambulance doors closed between them, and Hannah didn't see him again for 3 days. She had no idea, as the sirens she couldn't hear carried her away from the wreckage, that the man whose life she had just saved commanded the loyalty of thousands of men across 17 states. She had no idea his name was Cole Walker. She had no idea that within 24 hours that name would be spoken in hushed, disbelieving tones in every chapter house from Seattle to Miami. The national president of the Hells Angels had nearly died on a Montana highway. And the only reason he hadn't was a 22-year-old deaf art teacher who didn't even know who she'd saved. She had no idea that the black SUV she'd glimpsed in her peripheral vision, moments before the crash speeding away from the scene, instead of toward it, not slowing, not stopping, its driver's face turned deliberately away from the wreckage, was about to become the most important detail of her entire life. All Hannah knew lying in the back of that ambulance with her hands wrapped in gauze and her head pounding was that she had done what anyone should have done. She was wrong about how anyone would see it, but she wouldn't understand that for 3 more days. The hospital in Missoula kept Hannah overnight for observation, second-degree burns along her forearms, a mild concussion, dozens of small lacerations from the gravel and broken glass. The nurses were kind. They wrote notes on a whiteboard for her when the interpreter wasn't available, apologized with their eyes when they forgot, and simply talked over her, forgetting that words meant nothing to her unless she could see them. Hannah was used to being forgotten in small ways like that. She didn't hold it against anyone. She'd built an entire life around working with that particular kind of loneliness, and she'd made peace with it the way you make peace with weather. You didn't fight it, you just learned to dress for it. What she was not prepared for was what happened outside her hospital room door. It started the first night. Hannah woke around 2 in the morning, not from any sound obviously, but from the particular vibration of the door and the shift in light beneath it, and through the narrow window in the door, she saw 2 enormous men standing in the hallway. They wore leather vests like the stranger had, long beards, heavy boots, forearms wrapped in tattoos that told stories Hannah couldn't read from this distance. They weren't talking to the nurses. They weren't threatening anyone. They simply stood, arms crossed, back straight, positioned on either side of her door like sentries. Hannah pressed the call button, hard hammering, and when a nurse came in, she gestured toward the door, mouthing, "Are they safe? Are they here for me? Is something wrong?" The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Diane, who'd taken the time to learn a little basic sign over the years working nights, made the sign for safe, then wrote quickly on Hannah's whiteboard, "They've been here since you arrived. They won't say why. They're not causing any trouble. Security checked their names. They're clean. I think they're guarding you, honey." Hannah stared at the words for a long moment. Guarding her from what? She didn't sleep well that night, glancing at the door every hour, watching the shadows of the 2 men shift position but never leave. By morning, there were 4 men instead of 2. By the second night, 6. No one spoke to her. No one asked anything of her. They simply stood, silent and immovable, like a wall built entirely of leather and muscle, in something that looked unmistakably like grief. On the 3rd day, a man walked into Hannah's room alone. He was tall, maybe 50, with close-cropped gray hair and pale blue eyes that carried an exhaustion so deep it seemed to sit in his bones. He wore the same style of vest as the men in the hallway, black leather, a large patch on the back she still couldn't quite make out, and he moved carefully, respectfully, the way you'd move into a church. He held up a small notepad and a pen before he even sat down and wrote, "My name is Ryan Hayes. May I sit? I need to talk to you about the man you saved." Hannah nodded, curious despite the unease coiling in her stomach. Ryan sat in the chair beside her bed, and for a moment he simply looked at her. Really looked the way people rarely did, like he was trying to memorize her face. Then he began writing again, passing her the notepad, line by line, because he didn't know sign language and didn't want to rely on guesswork with something this important. "The man you pulled out of that fire is named Cole Walker. He's the national president of the Hells Angels. Has been for 11 years. Do you understand what that means?" Hannah shook her head slowly. She'd heard the name Hells Angels before, vaguely, the way most people had motorcycles, leather. Something from movies and news stories she'd never paid close attention to. She had no real understanding of what the name meant to the people who lived inside it. Ryan wrote more. "It means there are about 85,000 men worldwide who would lay down their lives for that man without hesitation. It means when word got out that he almost died on that highway and that a stranger ran into a burning truck to save him with no idea who he was, every one of them wanted to be here. We had to talk most of them out of flying in. The ones you've seen in the hallway are just the ones from our home chapter. They asked to stay. I couldn't say no to them, and honestly, I didn't want to." Hannah felt her throat tighten. She took the pen from him with trembling fingers and wrote back, I didn't do anything special. Anyone would have done the same thing. Ryan read her words and something moved behind his eyes, something between disbelief and profound sorrow. He wrote no. They wouldn't have. 3 other cars stopped at that wreck. 11 adults stood on that shoulder and watched. You were the only person who ran toward the fire instead of away from it. Cole Walker has led men into war zones, into prison riots, into gunfights that made national news, and in 30 years, nobody has ever done for him what you did on that highway expecting nothing in return. Hannah didn't know what to say to that. She looked down at her bandaged hands, the raw skin beneath the gauze still stinging, and shook her head again, quietly refusing the weight of what he was telling her. Ryan reached into his vest and pulled out an envelope thick with cash and set it gently on her lap. This is just the beginning of what the club wants to do for you. Please let us. Hannah pushed the envelope back toward him without hesitation. Her jaw set and wrote in firm, deliberate letters, I don't want money. I don't want anything. I saw a man dying and I helped him. That's all this is. Please don't make it more than that. Ryan studied her for a long moment, and something in his weathered face softened into something like awe. He wrote, Cole is going to want to meet you himself when he's strong enough. I need you to know, whatever you decide to accept or refuse from us, the men outside that door aren't going anywhere. Not until we're certain you're safe. Hannah frowned confused and wrote back the question that had been gnawing at her since the first night, safe from what? Was somebody after me? Ryan hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a beat, but Hannah caught it. She'd spent her whole life reading the tiny signals, hearing people didn't realize they were broadcasting the flickers of doubt and fear that crossed a face half a second before words came out. And in that half second, she saw real fear in Ryan Hayes' eyes. Not fear for himself, fear for her. He wrote carefully, Can I ask you something about the accident? Before the crash happened, did you see any other vehicles on the road? Anything unusual? Hannah thought back, forcing herself past the chaos of memory, past the smoke and the heat, and the 11 desperate seconds of dragging a stranger across broken pavement. She closed her eyes, and there it was, a detail she hadn't even realized she'd registered until this exact moment, surfacing now like something rising from dark water. A black SUV, speeding away from the crash site instead of toward it, not slowing down, not stopping to help. Windows tinted, moving fast, gone around the bend before the fuel tanker had even finished igniting. She grabbed the pen with sudden urgency and wrote yes. A black SUV. It was leaving the scene right when it happened, going fast away from the crash, not toward it. I only saw it for a second, but I remember it clearly. Why does that matter? Ryan Hayes went very still. He read her words twice. Hannah watched the color drain slowly from his face, watched his jaw tighten, watched him glance toward the door, as if to confirm the men outside were still there. When he finally wrote his answer, his handwriting had changed smaller. Tighter, the letters pressed hard into the paper, like he was trying to keep his hand from shaking. Hannah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That truck accident wasn't an accident. Cole's brakes were tampered with 3 days before that crash happened. We only found out this morning. Someone has been trying to kill him for months, and whoever did this thought they'd finally succeeded. Hannah's stomach dropped straight through the hospital bed. She stared at the words, reading them again and again, her pulse pounding so hard she could feel it in her bandaged palms. Ryan kept writing, his hand moving faster now, urgent. You're the only person who was close enough to that SUV to actually see it. Every other witness was too far away or too panicked to notice anything before the explosion. Do you understand what that means? You're not just the woman who saved Cole's life. Right now, you might be the only witness who can identify how someone tried to end it. Hannah felt the room tilt around her, though this time it had nothing to do with her damaged inner ear. She looked up at Ryan, her hands trembling as she wrote her final question, the one that would end this conversation and begin everything that came after it. Does that mean whoever did this knows I saw them too? Ryan Hayes didn't answer with words. He simply looked toward the door, toward the 6 silent, watchful men standing guard in the hallway outside, and Hannah understood his answer without needing to hear a single word of it. The next 2 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet that Hannah had never experienced before. Not the ordinary silence she'd lived inside her entire adult life, but a different kind. Heavier, charged with a tension she could feel radiating off every person who entered her room. The detective who came to question her on the fourth day introduced himself as Investigator Marcus Doyle, a state accident investigator with a kind of easy practice smile that Hannah had learned over years of navigating a hearing world that often underestimated her to view with quiet suspicion. He asked his questions through a hospital-provided interpreter, this time a young woman named Priya, who signed quickly and precisely. His questions seemed ordinary enough at first. What did you see? What time did you arrive? Did you notice anyone near the vehicles before the crash? But Hannah noticed things. She always noticed things. It was in many ways the great compensation life had given her for the hearing it had taken away. She noticed that Doyle's eyes lingered too long on her answer about the black SUV. She noticed he asked the same question about it 3 different ways, as if testing whether her story would shift. She noticed he wrote very little down for a man supposedly building an official report. When Doyle left, Ryan Hayes was waiting just outside her door, and the moment the detective was out of sight down the hallway, Ryan's expression changed completely. The careful, respectful patience Hannah had seen from him replaced by something sharp and alarmed. He came back into her room and wrote quickly on the notepad, "How much did you tell him about the SUV?" Hannah wrote back, "Everything I told you. Why, who is he?" Ryan's hand hesitated over the paper for a long moment before he wrote his answer, and when Hannah read it, ice ran straight down her spine. "That man is not who he says he is. We've had eyes on him for 2 years. He's on the payroll of a man named Victor Kessler, a man who has spent the last decade trying to destroy this club piece by piece. Insurance fraud trucking companies that don't exist, cops on his payroll from 3 different counties. We think Kessler ordered the hit on Cole. And you just told a man working for him exactly what you saw." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. She grabbed the pen, her hands shaking so badly the letters came out jagged. "What do I do now?" Ryan looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd met him, Hannah saw something in his weathered face that looked almost like tenderness beneath the fear. He wrote, "You don't do anything. We do. Starting tonight." Hannah didn't fully understand what that meant until nearly midnight, when Diane the nurse gently shook her awake, and with quick practice signs, more than Hannah had realized the older woman knew, told her to get dressed, that people were here for her, that it was safe, that Ryan Hayes had personally vouched for everything happening. Hannah stepped out of her hospital room into a hallway filled with more bikers than she had ever seen in one place in her life. They didn't speak, not because they couldn't, but because they seemed to understand somehow that quiet mattered to her, that the frantic mouthing and gesturing hearing people sometimes did around her only made things harder, not easier. Instead, they moved with purpose, calm, and coordinated, forming a corridor around her as she was walked carefully, an arm offered, but never forced upon her, through the hospital's back exit and into the cold Montana night. Ryan was waiting by an idling truck, his breath fogging in the darkness. He held up his notepad, already written on, prepared for this exact moment. "We're taking you somewhere safe. A ranch 2 hours from here. Cole is already there." He checked himself out of the hospital against doctor's orders the second he heard Kessler's people were closing in on you. He wouldn't let anyone else make this call. He said, and I'm quoting him exactly, "She ran into fire for me. I'm not letting her stand alone in this one." Hannah looked out at the line of motorcycles idling along the road, more than 100 of them, stretching back into the darkness, their riders silent and watchful, forming a moving wall of protection around a single truck, carrying a 22-year-old deaf art teacher who 3 days ago had never heard the words Hell's Angels spoken with anything but casual indifference. She climbed into the truck. As it pulled away from the hospital, flanked on all sides by 100 engines, she could feel thrumming through the floorboards, but never hear. Hannah Carter understood with sudden and total clarity that her ordinary life had ended on that highway 3 days ago. She just didn't yet understand how far this was going to go, how the partial license plate flickering at the edge of her memory, the damaged taillight she glimpsed for less than a second, the small unique dent along the SUV's rear panel that her unusually visual mind had captured, without her even realizing it would soon become the single thread that unraveled a criminal network spanning 3 states. She didn't know that Victor Kessler, sitting in a dark office 200 miles away, had just given an order that would put her name at the very top of a list no one ever wanted to be on. And she didn't know that Cole Walker, the man she'd pulled from fire without knowing his name, without knowing what he commanded, without expecting anything in return, was at that exact moment standing on the porch of a ranch house in the mountains, waiting for headlights that would bring the woman who'd saved his life directly into the most dangerous chapter of both their lives. The convoy rolled on through the darkness, engines growling beneath a canopy of stars. Hannah couldn't hear, but somehow watching the sky through the truck window felt more deeply than she ever had before. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone. The ranch house sat dark against the mountainside, its windows glowing amber against the pre-dawn black, and Hannah felt the truck slow beneath her before she saw why. Ryan tapped her shoulder gently and pointed through the windshield. A man stood on the porch. Even at this distance, even in darkness, Hannah recognized him instantly. The broad shoulders, the gray beard, though now it was neatly trimmed and no longer singed at the edges. Cole Walker stood with one hand braced against a porch post, favoring his left side, dressed in a plain flannel shirt instead of the scorched leather vest she remembered from the highway. He looked smaller somehow, standing still like that, than he had looked pinned beneath a burning truck. More human, more afraid. "Oh, my son." The truck stopped. Ryan came around and opened her door, and Hannah stepped down into the cold mountain air, her legs unsteady, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Cole came down the porch steps too fast for a man who should still have been in a hospital bed. He winced, one hand pressing briefly against his ribs, but he didn't slow down. He stopped 3 feet from her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Hannah watched his mouth waiting, and when he finally spoke, he spoke slowly, deliberately, his lips shaping each word with obvious care. Someone had clearly told him how to talk to her, how to make himself readable. "You pulled me out of a fire," he said, "and I don't even know your name." Hannah felt her throat tighten. She reached for the small notepad Ryan had given her in the truck and wrote quickly, "Hannah, Hannah Carter." Cole read it, and something in his weathered face cracked open, not quite a smile, something rawer than that. "Hannah," he repeated, mouthing it carefully. Then he did something that made Ryan visibly stiffen. Behind her, he closed the remaining distance between them and wrapped his arms around her, careful, hesitant, like a man who wasn't sure he had the right but couldn't stop himself from asking anyway. Hannah stood frozen for half a second. Then she hugged him back. She felt him shaking. This enormous, broad-shouldered man, a legend among thousands, trembled against her shoulder like a child, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes were wet. He didn't bother hiding it. He wrote on her notepad himself, this time his handwriting rough and uneven. 31 years I've led this club. I've buried brothers. I've survived things that should have killed me twice over. Nobody has ever done what you did. Nobody." Hannah shook her head, wrote back, "I keep telling everyone, anybody would have." Cole read her words and let out a short, disbelieving laugh, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He wrote, 11 people stood on that road and watched me burn. You're the only one who didn't. Stop arguing with me about this. You won't win." There was something almost gentle in the way he said it, teasing even beneath the exhaustion, and Hannah found herself, despite everything, fighting back a small smile. But the moment didn't last. A second truck came barreling up the gravel drive far too fast, headlights cutting wild across the yard, and every biker on the property turned toward it at once, hands moving instinctively toward jackets, toward waistbands. Ryan stepped in front of Hannah without thinking, his body angled protectively. The truck skidded to a stop. A young man Hannah didn't recognize jumped out breathless and ran straight to Cole, talking fast, his hands moving in urgent, jagged gestures Hannah couldn't fully follow from this distance. She watched Cole's face change, watched it go from raw emotion to something colder, harder, more dangerous. He turned to Ryan and said something short. Ryan's jaw tightened. He turned to Hannah and wrote quickly, his hand less steady than before they found her apartment. "Kessler's men broke in 20 minutes ago. Whoever it was tore the place apart looking for something. Neighbors called it in, but by the time anyone got there, they were gone." Hannah's stomach dropped straight through the ground. She grabbed the pen, hand shaking. "Looking for what? I don't have anything. I don't know anything except what I already told the detective." Ryan and Cole exchanged a look Hannah didn't like at all. Cole took the notepad from Ryan and wrote himself his letters, heavy, pressed hard into the paper. "They don't know that. All they know is you're the only witness who saw that SUV up close. To them, that makes you a loose end. And Kessler doesn't leave loose ends." Hannah felt the world tilt sideways again. Not her damaged inner ear this time, but something worse, something that lived in the pit of her stomach and had nothing to do with balance. She wrote, her hand trembling so badly the letters barely formed. Am I going to die because I helped you? Cole read the words. Something in his face went absolutely still, and when he looked up at her, his eyes had changed completely. Gone was the grateful, emotional man from a moment ago, replaced by something Hannah would only later understand was the national president of the Hells Angels, the man who had led thousands of dangerous men through 31 years of war without ever once losing. He took the pen back and wrote 3 words, underlining them twice. Not on my watch. Inside the ranch house, the atmosphere shifted into something Hannah could only describe as a war room. Men came and went, constantly checking perimeters, murmuring into phones, laying out maps across the long wooden dining table that dominated the main room. Hannah sat at the edge of it all, exhausted, overwhelmed, watching mouths move too fast for her to follow, until Ryan noticed and pulled a chair beside her, angling himself so she could read his lips clearly. "I'm sorry," he said, slow and deliberate. "This is a lot. I know it's a lot." Hannah nodded, then wrote on her notepad, "Who is Victor Kessler? I need to actually understand what I'm caught in the middle of." Ryan glanced toward Cole, who was standing across the room in low conversation with 2 older bikers, before he answered. "Kessler runs a shipping and logistics empire across 3 counties," Ryan said, speaking slowly enough that Hannah could follow most of it directly from his lips, filling gaps from context. "On paper, it's trucking companies, warehouses, legitimate business. Underneath it, it's insurance fraud on a massive scale, staged accidents, inflated cargo claims trucks that don't exist, hauling loads that don't exist. And underneath that," he hesitated. Hannah tapped the notepad impatiently. Underneath that, what Ryan's jaw tightened before he continued. "We think he's moving people, not just cargo. We've suspected it for 2 years, but never had proof solid enough to hand the FBI. Cole's club has been quietly investigating on our own, trying to build a case, trying to protect the girls he might be moving through those routes before anyone in law enforcement even believes it's happening." Hannah stared at him, horror creeping cold through her chest. She wrote, "And Cole tried to expose him. That's why someone cut his brakes." Ryan nodded grimly. 3 weeks ago, Cole met with a federal agent, off the books, informal, just feeling out whether the Bureau would take our evidence seriously. 4 days later, his truck's brake line failed on a mountain road he's driven 1,000 times. That's not coincidence, that's a message. Hannah's hands hovered over the paper, and then she wrote the question that had been building in her chest since the hospital. If Kessler already tried to kill him once and failed, what's stopping him from trying again, right here? Ryan's expression didn't soften, but something steady entered it. The calm of a man who had already answered this question for himself a dozen times over. "This ranch belongs to Cole's family," he said. 3 generations. There's exactly 1 road in, and right now that road has 6 men on it around the clock. Every person on this property has been with the club longer than you've been alive. Nobody gets close to Cole here, or to you." Hannah wanted to believe him. Some small, exhausted part of her did. But another part, the part that had learned over 22 years of navigating a world that too often failed to protect her, that promises of safety rarely accounted for people like Victor, Kessler, remained braced, waiting. She didn't have to wait long for her instincts to be proven right. 2 days into her stay at the ranch, Hannah woke before dawn to a hand gently shaking her shoulder. She startled upright, disoriented, and found one of the younger bikers, a woman actually with cropped dark hair and kind eyes. Someone Hannah had learned was named Sarah, kneeling beside her bed, a phone flashlight angled downward so as not to blind her. Sarah signed slow and imperfect, but clear enough. "Cole wants you. Now. Important." Hannah dressed quickly, pulse already climbing, and followed Sarah down the hallway to the main room, where she found Cole, Ryan, and 3 other men clustered around a laptop, faces tight with tension. A young man Hannah didn't recognize, younger than the rest, with the careful, watchful posture of someone new to this kind of pressure, sat at the keyboard, scrolling through what looked like security footage. Ryan noticed her arrival and immediately turned, writing fast on the whiteboard someone had set up in the corner specifically for her. "We pulled traffic cam footage from 3 intersections near the crash site. Found something." He gestured to the young man at the laptop, who turned the screen toward Hannah. A grainy black SUV rolled across the frame, caught at a red light 2 miles from the crash site, timestamped 4 minutes before the collision. Hannah leaned forward, heart pounding, studying it with the same intense visual focus she brought to everything in a world that offered her no auditory cues, only sight. There, On the rear panel, just above the wheel well, a small distinctive dent, the same one she'd glimpsed in the half-second before the SUV sped away from the burning wreck. She grabbed the whiteboard marker with shaking hands and wrote, "That's it. That's the vehicle. I'm certain." The room seemed to collectively exhale relief, but also something heavier, something closer to dread, because confirmation meant this was real, meant the threat wasn't paranoia, meant somewhere out there a man had ordered a murder and very nearly gotten away with it. Cole read her confirmation and turned to the younger man at the laptop. "Run the plate again. Every angle we've got." The young man's fingers moved fast across the keyboard, pulling up partial plate data, enhanced from multiple camera angles, cross-referencing registration databases the club apparently had access to through channels Hannah didn't fully understand and didn't ask about. A name appeared on screen. Ryan read it aloud, then immediately wrote it for Hannah. "Registered to a shell company. Meridian Freight Solutions, same company that owns the trucking business the tanker driver worked for." Cole's expression darkened into something Hannah hadn't seen on him yet. Not grief, not gratitude, but a cold, focused fury that made the whole room go quiet around him. "Kessler's company," he said, and even without fully hearing him, Hannah felt the weight in his voice through the tension in every face around the table. "He owns the trucking company that had the accident. He owns the SUV that fled the scene. He tried to kill me and set it up to look like two random trucks colliding." Ryan nodded grimly, then turned back to Hannah, writing quickly, "This is enough to take to the FBI. Real evidence, not just suspicion, but it also means Kessler knows exactly how close we are to proving it, which makes you more of a target, not less." Hannah felt her stomach clench, but this time something else rose up alongside the fear. Something sharper, more determined. She thought of the doctor's office in Kalispell, the number written on the notepad, $87,000, she'd never be able to afford because the world so rarely bent itself to accommodate someone like her. She thought about how, for 22 years, she had learned to be quiet, to be careful, to not make waves, because making waves as a deaf woman in a hearing world so often meant being punished for it. She was done being quiet. She wrote, pressing the marker hard against the whiteboard, "Then let's finish proving it. I saw that SUV. I'll testify to anything you need. I'm not hiding from this." Cole read her words, and for a long moment he simply looked at her. Really looked the way Ryan had looked at her in the hospital, like he was trying to understand how someone this young, this vulnerable in the eyes of the world could possess this much unshakable resolve. He wrote back, "You already gave me my life once. You don't have to give anything else." Hannah shook her head firmly and wrote beneath his words, "I'm not doing this for you anymore. I'm doing it because it's right. There's a difference and it matters." Something in Cole's face shifted at that, a flicker of surprise and something that looked almost like pride. So the FBI agent arrived at the ranch 2 days later, and Hannah understood immediately that this was not a formality. His name was Agent Daniel Reyes, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, dressed in a plain gray suit that looked deliberately unremarkable, the kind of man who had learned long ago how to disappear into a room when he needed to and command it completely when he didn't. He sat across from Hannah at the long wooden table, an interpreter beside him. This time the club had apparently arranged for a certified interpreter or to travel out specifically for this meeting, something that touched Hannah more than she expected it to. "Ms. Carter," Agent Reyes said, and the interpreter's hands moved smoothly, translating in real time. "I want to be direct with you about what you're walking into. What you saw on that highway and the evidence Mr. Walker's organization has gathered since gives us enough to open a formal federal investigation into Victor Kessler's operations. But I need you to understand, once that investigation is public, you become a named witness. That comes with real risk." Hannah signed her response, and the interpreter spoke it aloud for the room. "I already understand the risk. Someone already broke into my apartment. I'd rather be a witness who helped stop this than a victim who never got the chance to." Reyes studied her for a long moment, something like respect passing briefly across his controlled expression. "Most people don't have that kind of nerve," he said. "Most people can hear the danger coming and run from it in time." Hannah signed back, and the interpreter's voice carried the wry edge Hannah had put into the gesture. "I never had that option. I learned a long time ago that running isn't always available to me, so I stopped running." The corner of Reyes's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. He turned to Cole. "Your organization's evidence gathering has been thorough. More thorough, frankly, than what my office has managed in 2 years of trying to build a case on Kessler through conventional channels. I won't pretend that doesn't complicate things politically, but it also means we're finally in a position to move. Cole leaned forward. What kind of timeline are we talking about? If Ms. Carter agrees to formally testify and your organization is willing to hand over the footage, the registration data, and whatever else you've compiled, I can have warrants moving within the week. Kessler's operation is big, multiple counties, possibly multiple states. This isn't a single raid. This is coordinated, and it has to be airtight or a good lawyer unravels the whole thing in court. Hannah watched the exchange closely, reading lips, reading the tension in shoulders and jaws, understanding more from the room's body language than she suspected most hearing people in her position would have caught from words alone. Then something shifted. One of the younger bikers burst into the room without knocking, breathless phone in hand, and the entire table turned toward him at once. He spoke fast, too fast for Hannah to follow, but she watched Ryan's face go white, watched Cole's hands curl into fists on the table. Ryan turned to her immediately, grabbing the whiteboard marker with shaking urgency. Doyle the detective just filed an official report naming you as an unreliable witness. Says your hearing impairment makes your identification of the SUV inadmissible. He's trying to get you disqualified before you can even testify. Hannah read the words, and fury rose in her chest so fast and so hot it startled her. She grabbed the marker from Ryan's hand and wrote back, pressing so hard the marker squeaked against the board. My eyes work perfectly. I identified that vehicle from visual memory more precisely than anyone else at that scene. Being deaf doesn't make me blind. It doesn't make me stupid. It doesn't make me wrong. Agent Reyes, reading over her shoulder, spoke up immediately. It won't hold up. Visual identification from a witness with no hearing impairment, relevant to visual memory, is completely admissible, and frankly, Ms. Carter's account is more detailed and more consistent than most witnesses I've worked with in 20 years. Doyle knows that. This isn't a legal maneuver. This is Kessler getting desperate and using a dirty cop to try to discredit you before you can testify. Cole's jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath his beard. Which means Kessler's scared. Reyes agreed, and scared men make mistakes, but it also means he's going to escalate. Discrediting Ms. Carter publicly is step one. I need everyone in this room to understand that step two is usually worse. The room went very quiet. Hannah felt every eye turned toward her, felt the weight of unspoken fear pressing down on the table, and she made herself sit up straighter, made herself hold Reyes's gaze steadily, even as her heart pounded against her ribs. She wrote on the whiteboard, slow and deliberate this time, each letter a decision. I'm not backing down. Whatever step two is, I'll face it. I didn't run from a burning truck. I'm not running from this either. Cole read her words, and something passed between him and Ryan, a silent understanding forged over decades of brotherhood, of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Cole stood his chair, scraping back hard against the wooden floor. And when he spoke, Hannah read his lips with total clarity because he made absolutely certain she could. Then nobody touches her. Not Doyle, not Kessler, not one single man on his payroll. We triple the watch on this ranch starting tonight, and anyone who so much as looks at her wrong answers to me personally. The men around the table nodded, grim and resolute, and Hannah felt something she hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all this danger and fear she felt for the first time in longer than she could remember. Completely unwilling to be small and completely surrounded by people determined to make sure she never had to be. That night, unable to sleep, Hannah wandered out onto the ranch house porch, wrapped in a borrowed jacket, too large for her frame, and found Cole already there, sitting alone on the steps, staring out at the dark tree line beyond the perimeter lights. He noticed her and patted the step beside him, and Hannah sat grateful for the company, even in silence, especially in silence, because silence had never once felt uncomfortable to her, only the frantic scramble of people trying too hard to fill it. Cole pulled out his phone and typed something, turning the screen toward her, instead of reaching for the notepad this time. I keep thinking about something. 11 people watched me die and did nothing. You didn't know my name, didn't know what club I rode for, didn't know if I was a good man or a bad one. You just saw somebody who needed help. That's rare, Hannah. Rarer than you understand. Hannah read it twice, then typed her reply into her own phone, turning it toward him. I've spent my whole life being the person nobody notices. The girl in the back who can't hear the conversation, who gets left out because it's easier than including her. I think that's exactly why I couldn't just stand there and watch you die. I know what it feels like to be invisible. I wasn't going to let you become invisible too. Cole read her words and his throat worked visibly before he managed to type his response. You're not invisible to me. You never will be again. Hannah felt tears sting her eyes, unexpected and sudden, and she looked away toward the dark trees, embarrassed by how deeply his words had landed. Cole nudged her shoulder gently, and when she looked back at him, he was smiling, tired, but genuine. He typed, for what it's worth, thousands of very dangerous men are now extremely invested in your safety. That's not nothing. Hannah laughed a real laugh, surprising herself with it, the first one since the accident, and typed back, I noticed. It's a lot to get used to. You get used to it, Cole typed, then added, we take care of our own. You're one of ours now, whether you meant to be or not. Hannah sat with that for a long moment, watching the tree line, feeling the cold mountain air against her face, and understanding with a clarity that settled deep into her chest that her life had irreversibly changed course 3 days ago on a burning highway, and that whatever came next, whatever danger Victor Kessler still intended to bring down on her, she would not be facing it as the invisible girl in the back of the room anymore. She was done being invisible. But 300 yards beyond the ranch's perimeter lights, hidden in the tree line, Hannah had just been staring into a man lay motionless in the underbrush, a long lens camera pressed to his eye, photographing the porch, photographing Cole, photographing Hannah's face in careful, methodical detail. He lowered the camera slowly, pulled a phone from his jacket, and typed a single text message before melting back into the darkness. Confirmed location. Girl is with Walker. Awaiting further instructions. The message sent successfully, blinking once before disappearing into the dark. Hannah, warm on the porch beside a man who had promised her safety, had no idea that somewhere in the black trees beyond the light, Victor Kessler's next move was already in motion, and that the quiet mountain sanctuary she'd finally begun to trust was not nearly as invisible as everyone believed. The text message that flashed across the screen 200 miles away landed on Victor Kessler's desk at 11:41 that night, and by 11:43, he had already made the call that would set the next phase of his plan into motion. Hannah knew none of this yet. She only knew that morning arrived at the ranch with a strange tension humming beneath the surface of everything, men speaking in low-clipped voices. Ryan checking his phone every few minutes with a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there the day before, Cole disappearing into a back room for nearly an hour with Agent Reyes and 2 other men Hannah didn't recognize. She was sitting at the kitchen table picking at breakfast. She didn't have much appetite for when Sarah slid into the chair across from her, tablet in hand, and began typing. Something happened last night. A trail camera on the north perimeter caught movement. We pulled the footage this morning. Hannah's stomach tightened. She reached for the tablet, and Sarah turned it toward her, pulling up a grainy night vision clip. A man barely visible crouched in the tree line roughly 300 yards from the house, a long object pressed to his face that Hannah recognized immediately, even in poor resolution, as a camera with a telephoto lens. The clip lasted 11 seconds before the man melted back into the darkness. Hannah's hands went cold. She typed back, he was watching us, watching the porch, watching me. Sarah's expression was grim as she nodded and typed her reply. Cole saw the footage first thing this morning. He hasn't said much since. Ryan thinks Kessler's people have known our location for at least 2 days, maybe longer. Hannah felt her pulse spike, the safety she'd started to feel over the past days cracking like thin ice underfoot. She pushed back from the table, suddenly needing to move, needing to find Cole, needing to understand exactly how much danger she was actually standing inside. She found him in the back room alone now, Reyes and the others apparently having left. He was staring at a laptop screen, jaw tight, and when he saw her in the doorway, he didn't try to hide the screen from her. He simply gestured her over. The footage was queued up, paused on the crouched figure in the trees. Cole typed on his phone, turning it toward her. We identified him. Facial recognition matched him to a man named Grant Ferris, former private security contractor, currently on Meridian Freight's payroll, one of Kessler's companies. He wasn't here to take pictures for fun, Hannah. He was here to confirm you're a real target worth the risk. Hannah read the words twice, feeling the floor tilt beneath her in that old familiar way that had nothing to do with her damaged inner ear. She typed back, her fingers unsteady. So what happens now? Do we run? Move somewhere else? Cole shook his head firmly before he even finished reading and typed his answer with the kind of decisive speed that told her he'd already thought this through. Running tells Kessler we're scared and gives him time to regroup. We already have enough evidence pointing at him. Reyes thinks we can move the timeline up. Instead of waiting a week, we push for warrants in 72 hours. The faster this becomes public and federal, the faster you stop being a useful target and start being a witness the whole country's watching. Public witnesses are much harder to make disappear quietly. Hannah stared at the words, absorbing the strange cold logic of it, understanding that her only real protection now wasn't hiding, it was being seen by too many people for Kessler to risk touching her. She typed back, "Then let's move faster. I'm not interested in waiting around while that man decides when it's convenient to come after me." Cole looked up from the phone and met her eyes, and something passed between them. Not quite a smile, but close to respect, the same look Agent Reyes had given her at the table 2 days before. He typed one more line before closing the laptop. "You scare me a little, you know that, in the best way." Hannah almost laughed, despite everything, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly, just enough to breathe. The next 2 days moved faster than Hannah had expected anything to move inside the strange, suspended reality she'd been living in since the highway. Reyes returned to the ranch with 2 additional agents, and what had felt like a quiet, informal gathering around a kitchen table transformed almost overnight into something that resembled an actual command center, laptops lining the dining table, a corkboard covered in photographs and connecting strings that made Hannah think absurdly of every crime show she'd ever half-watched with the captions on. She spent hours going over her memory of the crash again and again, working with a forensic sketch artist who specialized in vehicle identification, refining every detail she could recall about the SUV, the dent, the tint of the windows, the particular shade of black that had seemed in her memory almost too dark, like it had been recently repainted. That detail, it turned out, mattered enormously. "Recently repainted," Reyes repeated when Hannah signed the observation to the interpreter during one of their sessions. "Are you certain?" Hannah nodded firmly and signed her answer. The paint looked wet slick in a way older paint doesn't, almost too dark, like it hadn't fully cured. "I noticed it because it caught the light strangely as it drove away." Reyes exchanged a look with one of the other agents, and Hannah watched something click into place behind his eyes. "There's a body shop registered under one of Kessler's shell companies," he said slowly, thinking it through even as he spoke. "We've had it flagged for 2 years as a possible chop shop operation, but we never had probable cause to search it. If that SUV was repainted recently, there's a real chance it happened there. And if it happened there might be security footage," Ryan finished, leaning forward, "or records. Something that ties the vehicle directly back to Kessler's operation instead of just a company name on paper." Reyes nodded slowly, a grim, focused energy settling over the room. "I can get a warrant for that shop within 24 hours based on what we already have, plus this new detail. If there's footage, if there's a paper trail, we're not just building a circumstantial case anymore. We're building an airtight one." Hannah felt a small, fierce satisfaction rise in her chest, the first genuinely good feeling she'd had in days. She'd spent her whole life being underestimated, being spoken over, being treated as though her perspective mattered less because it arrived through a different sense than everyone else's. And now the single detail that might crack open an entire criminal empire had come from her eyes, the very thing people so often forgot to value when they were busy pitying what she couldn't hear. She signed to Ryan, and he translated aloud for the room. "Tell them I said you're welcome." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the room, and even Reyes cracked a small, genuine smile, the tension of the past 2 days easing for just a moment. It didn't last. The call came in at just past 2 in the afternoon, and Hannah knew immediately from the sudden shift in the room, every head turning toward Ryan's phone, every conversation stopping mid-sentence, that something had gone badly wrong. Ryan listened for nearly a full minute, his face draining of color before he hung up and turned to the room, his hands shaking slightly as he grabbed the whiteboard. "Warrant executed on the body shop 20 minutes ago. Found the SUV. Confirmed match to the vehicle Hannah identified. But that's not the problem." He erased it fast, writing again faster this time. "Grant Ferris, the man who was photographing the ranch, was found dead inside the shop. Single gunshot, looks staged to appear self-inflicted, but the angle's wrong. Kessler's cleaning house, eliminating anyone who could connect him directly to the surveillance on Hannah." The room went utterly silent. Hannah stared at the words, feeling something cold and sick settle into her stomach. A man had died. A man who had only 2 days ago been crouched in the trees, photographing her face, had now been murdered by the very people who'd sent him there, not out of mercy, not out of any twisted sense of justice, but purely to erase a loose end before it could talk. She typed with trembling hands on her own phone, turning it toward Cole. If he's killing his own men to cover his tracks, what does that mean? He's willing to do to me. Cole read her words, and his expression hardened into something Hannah hadn't seen from him before. Not grief, not fury exactly, but a kind of grim, focused calculation that told her he had already been asking himself the exact same question. He typed back, "It means we don't wait 72 hours anymore. Reyes is pushing for warrants tonight. Every hour we wait now is an hour Kessler spends deciding you're worth more dead than the risk of leaving you alive." Hannah nodded, throat tight, and forced herself to keep her hand steady as she typed her response. "Then let's not give him that hour." Reyes worked the phones for the next 6 hours, moving through what Hannah gathered from the tense, clipped body language around her was an unusually fast, almost unprecedented process of pushing multiple federal warrants through in a single night. Judges were called, affidavits were drafted and redrafted. Hannah sat through 2 more formal interview sessions, her account cross-checked and verified against every piece of physical evidence the investigation had assembled, until even the most skeptical of the agents in the room seemed satisfied there wasn't a single inconsistency to exploit. By 10 that night, Reyes returned to the main room with an expression Hannah hadn't seen on him before, something almost like relief, weighted down still by exhaustion and urgency. "We have warrants," he said, and the interpreter's hands moved fast to keep pace with him. "Kessler's main office, 2 warehouses, the trucking company's headquarters, and Doyle, the detective. We're bringing him in tonight before he has any chance to warn Kessler what's coming." A ripple of tense energy moved through the room. Not celebration, not yet, but something close to it, the particular electricity of people who had been holding their breath for days, finally allowing themselves to exhale. Cole stood jaw tight, and Hannah watched him ask something urgent, watched Reyes's expression shift. Ryan translated quickly on the whiteboard for her benefit. "Cole's asking if this means it's over. Reyes says not yet. Kessler himself is still out there. Once he realizes what's happening tonight, there's no telling what he'll do. Desperate men are the most dangerous kind." Hannah felt that cold weight settle back into her stomach, the small relief of a moment ago already curdling into fresh dread. She'd allowed herself for just a few seconds to imagine this might actually be close to over. Now she understood, watching the tension return to every face in the room, that the most dangerous hours might still be ahead of them. She was right. The raids began just after midnight, and though Hannah couldn't hear the chaos unfolding across 3 counties, the shouted commands, the battering rams, the screech of tires as federal vehicles converged on warehouses and offices simultaneously, she felt every minute of it in the tense electric atmosphere of the ranch house, where Ryan and 2 other men monitored a radio and relayed updates to her in rapid, urgent handwriting on the whiteboard. "Warehouse 1 secure, 6 arrests. Trucking headquarters secure. Record seized, looks massive, way bigger than we thought. Doyle taken into custody at his home. No resistance." Hannah read each update with her heart hammering, allowing herself bit by bit to hope that this nightmare might actually be closing. Then just past 1 in the morning, Ryan's hand froze mid-sentence on the whiteboard, his face going pale as he listened to something coming through the radio. He turned to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Hannah saw real, unguarded fear on Ryan Hayes' face. He wrote fast, his hand shaking. "Kessler's main office is empty. He's not there. Nobody's seen him in 6 hours. He knew this was coming." Hannah's blood ran cold. She grabbed the marker from Ryan's trembling hand and wrote, underlining hard, where would he go? What would he do if he knew everything was collapsing? Ryan didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Cole, who had gone very still across the room, his expression unreadable in a way that frightened Hannah more than open panic would have. Cole crossed to her, took the marker, and wrote slowly, deliberately, each word weighted with a gravity that made Hannah's stomach drop before she'd even finished reading. "A man like Kessler doesn't run when he's cornered. He finishes what he started. And the one piece of unfinished business that could still come on him in his mind is you." The next 40 minutes passed in a blur Hannah would never fully be able to reconstruct afterward, no matter how many times she tried. She remembered Cole shouting orders she couldn't hear. Remembered men moving fast around the house, checking windows, checking doors. Remembered Sarah pulling her firmly away from any window, with a clear line of sight to the tree line. Remembered the particular specific terror of standing in a house full of armed, capable men and still feeling, deep in her chest, that none of it might be enough. She remembered Ryan's hands shaking as he wrote, "Perimeter cameras just caught 2 vehicles approaching from the county road. Not local, not law enforcement. ETA, 4 minutes." She remembered Cole's face when he read it. Not fear, but something colder, harder. The face of a man who had led people into danger for 31 years and knew exactly what needed to happen next. He turned to her and wrote just 3 words before Ryan and Sarah pulled her toward the back of the house, toward a reinforced room Hannah hadn't even known existed until that exact moment, hidden behind what looked like an ordinary pantry door. "Stay here, please." Hannah wanted to argue. Every instinct in her body screamed against being hidden away, while the people who had risked everything for her faced down whatever was coming up that gravel drive. But Sarah's grip on her arm was firm, and the look in her eyes pleading urgent made Hannah's protest die in her throat. She let herself be pulled into the small, windowless room, and the door closed behind her with a heavy final sound she felt through the floor rather than heard. Alone in the dark, Hannah pressed her back against the wall and slid down to the floor, her whole body trembling, her mind racing through every possible outcome of the next few minutes. She had no way of knowing what was happening beyond that door. No way of hearing shouted warnings, engine roars, anything at all. She simply sat in absolute silence, the same silence that had defined her entire adult life, and waited, feeling for the first time in years that her deafness wasn't just an inconvenience or a source of quiet grief. It was in this exact moment a kind of unbearable helplessness. She had no idea if Cole was safe, no idea if Ryan and Sarah, who had shown her nothing but kindness and fierce protection since the moment she'd woken up in that hospital room, were walking into danger she couldn't warn them about, couldn't help with, couldn't even witness. Minutes passed. Hannah had no way to measure how many 5, 10, 20 they all blurred together into the same suffocating stretch of unknowing until finally the door opened. Sarah stood there breathless, and the expression on her face told Hannah everything before a single word was written. Relief. Sarah dropped to her knees and signed quickly, her hands less than perfectly fluent, but clear enough. Safe. Everyone's safe. Come. Hannah scrambled up and followed her out into the main room where the scene that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. 3 men she didn't recognize knelt on the floor, hands zip-tied behind their backs, surrounded by a dozen bikers, and standing near the front door, with his weapon still drawn, Agent Reyes himself, who must have arrived faster than Hannah had realized during the chaos. Cole stood near the center of the room, unharmed, his shirt torn at one shoulder, but otherwise whole. And when he saw Hannah emerge from the hallway, something in his face broke open with relief so raw it made her chest ache. He crossed to her, fast grabbing his phone with hands that weren't quite steady, and typed, "They came for you." 3 of Kessler's men. "We were ready. Nobody on our side got hurt. You're safe." Hannah read the words twice, her whole body shaking with the release of terror she hadn't fully let herself feel until this exact moment, and she looked past Cole's shoulder to the 3 men kneeling on the floor, men who had driven up that gravel road, intending to hurt her, to silence her, to erase the one witness standing between Victor Kessler and total collapse. She typed back, her hands barely steady enough to manage it. "Where is Kessler? Was he with them?" Cole's expression tightened, and he shook his head before typing his answer. "No, he sent them. He's still out there somewhere. This isn't over yet." "But Hannah, look at me." She looked up from the phone, meeting his eyes directly. He didn't type anything else for a moment. He simply held her gaze steady and fierce, and then mouthed something slow and deliberate enough that she could read it clearly, even through her own residual shock. "We are not losing you. Not tonight. Not ever." On it, Reyes took over the room within minutes, coordinating with a speed and authority that told Hannah, even through the chaos, that federal reinforcements were already converging on the ranch. The 3 captured men were read their rights and loaded into vehicles that arrived faster than seemed possible, and Reyes himself approached Hannah directly once the immediate danger had passed, his interpreter hurrying to keep pace beside him. "Ms. Carter," he said, and Hannah watched his controlled professional demeanor crack slightly at the edges, revealing something like genuine relief underneath. I owe you an apology. I underestimated how quickly Kessler would escalate once he realized the raids were happening tonight. That's on me, not you. Hannah signed her response and the interpreter translated aloud. You got here in time. That's what matters. Reyes nodded, then continued his tone, shifting back toward business, though the tension in his shoulders hadn't fully released. We picked up 2 of the 3 men who came here tonight with phones still on them. One of them made a call to a burner number 20 minutes before he arrived at this property. We're tracing it now, but preliminary triangulation puts the signal somewhere in a rural stretch about 40 miles east of here. Cole, standing close enough to read the interpreter's translation over Hannah's shoulder, spoke up immediately. That's near the old Kessler family property. Hunting cabin off-grid, no utilities on record. If he's running, that's exactly where a man like him would go, somewhere he thinks nobody else knows about. Reyes considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. It's worth checking, but I want to be clear with everyone in this room, we do this properly. Federal agents make the approach. Nobody from the club goes near that property. I understand the instinct to finish this yourselves, but the second any of you sets foot near an active federal apprehension, you hand Kessler's lawyers an appeal they'll ride for years. Hannah watched Cole's jaw tighten. Watched the visible effort it took him to nod in agreement, and she understood, even without needing anyone to translate the tension in the room, that everyone present wanted this finished tonight, cleanly, permanently, and that Reyes's caution, however necessary, was costing every one of them something. She signed quickly and the interpreter translated, What happens to me? Now, do I stay here? Do I go somewhere else? Reyes's expression softened slightly as he answered, For tonight you stay here under protection. Once we have Kessler in custody, and I believe we will likely within the next 24 hours, the immediate danger to you drops significantly. He's the one giving the orders. Without him directing the operation, the remaining players scatter fast. They're not loyal to a cause, they're loyal to a paycheck, and paychecks stop coming once the man signing them is behind bars. Hannah nodded, absorbing this, allowing herself the smallest flicker of hope that an end might genuinely be in sight. The next 20 hours passed in a strange, suspended tension. Hannah would later struggle to describe to anyone who hadn't lived through it, not the sharp, immediate terror of the SUV approaching the ranch, but a slower, grinding kind of waiting that wore at her nerves in an entirely different way. She stayed close to Cole and Ryan through most of it, unable to focus on anything else, watching updates arrive in fragments through Ryan's increasingly exhausted handwriting on the whiteboard. Agents converging on the cabin location. ETA 30 minutes. Confirmed vehicle registered to Kessler parked on the property. Movement detected inside. Agents in position. Hannah sat at the kitchen table gripping a mug of coffee she hadn't touched in an hour, watching Cole pace the length of the room, watching the particular kind of restless energy of a man who had spent 31 years solving problems with his own 2 hands, now forced to wait powerless for other people to finish what had started on a Montana highway with his own truck's severed brake line. Then just past 6 in the morning, Ryan's phone buzzed, and Hannah watched him snatch it up so fast he nearly dropped it. He read the message, and his whole body sagged. Not with bad news, Hannah realized after a heart-stopping half-second of dread, but with overwhelming, exhausted relief. He turned the whiteboard toward her, his hands shaking as he wrote. They got him. Victor Kessler is in federal custody. No shots fired. He surrendered the moment agents breached the cabin. It's over, Hannah. It's actually over. Hannah stared at the words for a long, disbelieving moment, waiting for the relief to hit her the way she'd imagined it would during all those long, terrified hours of waiting. Instead, what came first was tears, sudden, overwhelming, pouring down her face, before she'd even fully processed the words. 4 days of accumulated terror and grief and adrenaline finally breaking loose all at once. Cole crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt in front of her chair, taking her hands gently in his, and when she looked up at him through blurred vision, he wasn't hiding his own tears either. He didn't reach for his phone this time. He simply mouthed the words slowly, carefully, making absolutely certain she could read every single one. You did this. You saved my life on that highway, and then you saved this entire investigation, and you did it all while people were trying to kill you. Do you understand what that makes you? Hannah shook her head, unable to speak, even if she'd had the ability to, tears still falling freely. Cole squeezed her hands and mouthed one final word, simple and absolute. Extraordinary. Around them, the ranch house filled with the sound Hannah would never hear, but could feel radiating through every surface. Men embracing voices, rising in relief and celebration. 4 days of unbearable tension, finally breaking loose into something that looked, even to Hannah's eyes, remarkably like joy. But even as the room around her erupted into celebration, even as Ryan wrapped her in a fierce, grateful hug, and Sarah wiped tears from her own eyes nearby, Hannah caught something in Cole's expression that gave her pause, a flicker of something underneath the relief, something that looked almost like hesitation, like a man carrying one more piece of news he wasn't yet certain how to deliver. She pulled back slightly and reached for his phone, typing a question that had been sitting quietly beneath all her relief since the moment the words "it's over" had appeared on the whiteboard. "What aren't you telling me?" Cole read her question, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, weighing something behind his eyes. Then he took the phone back and began to type slowly, deliberately, and Hannah watched his face as he composed whatever it was he'd been holding back through all the celebration around them. When he finally turned the screen toward her, the words on it stopped her breath completely. Reyes just called. When they searched Kessler's cabin, they found files, financial records going back almost 15 years. "It's bigger than we thought, Hannah, much bigger, and your name isn't the only one connected to what they found." Hannah stared at the screen, her relief curdling instantly back into cold, sharp dread, and she looked up at Cole with a question in her eyes that she didn't need words to ask. Cole held her gaze steadily, and though the celebration continued around them, oblivious, something in the room between the two of them went suddenly terribly quiet. Hannah's hands trembled as she typed her response, her eyes never leaving Cole's face. "Whose name? What did they find?" Cole hesitated, and that hesitation frightened her more than anything he could have said. He took the phone back slowly and began typing, choosing his words with obvious care. "Reyes wouldn't give me all the details over the phone. Said it's too sensitive for a call, but he mentioned county officials, a judge, possibly someone in state government. Kessler wasn't just running fraud and trafficking on his own, he was paying people to look away. For years." Hannah felt the floor tilt beneath her again, that same sickening vertigo that had nothing to do with her inner ear damage. She had assumed in her exhaustion and relief that Kessler's arrest meant the end. She hadn't considered that his cabin might hold the names of everyone who had helped him build an empire out of silence and fear. She typed back, her fingers unsteady. "Does that mean this isn't over, that there are more people who might still want me gone?" Cole read the question, and something in his jaw tightened before he answered. He didn't try to soften it for her, and Hannah found herself grateful for that. She'd had enough of people deciding what version of the truth she could handle. "Reyes says he wants to meet with both of us this afternoon, in person. He wouldn't say more than that over an open line, which tells me it's serious. I don't want to scare you, but I also promised myself I wouldn't lie to you. So yes, this might not be finished." Hannah closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, forcing the fresh wave of fear back down into something she could function around. Then she opened them, met Cole's gaze steadily, and typed one more line before setting the phone down. "Then we keep going. I didn't come this far to stop now." Cole looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and proud moving behind his tired eyes, and he reached out and squeezed her hand, once firm and grounding, before standing to tell Ryan they needed to prepare for Reyes's arrival. Agent Reyes returned to the ranch just after 2 that afternoon, but this time he wasn't alone. 2 additional agents flanked him, along with a woman in a tailored gray suit whom Reyes introduced as Assistant U.S. Attorney Diane Foster. And the moment Hannah saw the weight of files tucked under Foster's arm, she understood this meeting would be nothing like the informal conversations of the past few days. They gathered around the same long wooden table that had become the center of Hannah's entire world over the past week, and Foster wasted no time laying out 3 thick folders, sliding them across the table's surface with the brisk efficiency of someone who had already spent a sleepless night reading every page inside them. "What we found in Kessler's cabin," Foster began, and the interpreter's hands moved fast to keep pace, "goes considerably beyond insurance fraud and the trafficking operation we already suspected. We're looking at a documented pattern of bribery spanning 14 years, involving officials across 3 counties, a sitting judge, 2 former sheriffs, and most concerning for our purposes, the current district attorney's office." Hannah's stomach dropped. She signed quickly, and the interpreter translated. "The DA's office, the people who are supposed to be prosecuting Kessler." Foster nodded grimly. Exactly the problem. We believe Kessler had at least one person inside that office feeding him information about ongoing investigations for years, which explains why every previous attempt to build a case against him fell apart before it ever reached a courtroom. Files went missing. Witnesses recanted. Evidence got ruled inadmissible on technicalities that shouldn't have held up. Cole leaned forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. So the whole system was compromised. That's why nobody ever touched him. That's our working theory, Reyes confirmed, and it's why this case is being handled entirely out of my office now at the federal level, completely bypassing the local DA. We can't risk another leak. Hannah felt a fresh wave of dread settle over her, and she signed her next question with hands that weren't quite steady. If people inside the system were protecting him, how do we know it's actually safe now? How do we know there isn't someone else out there still working for him? Foster's expression softened slightly at the question, though her answer remained careful, measured. We don't know that with absolute certainty yet, Ms. Carter. That's precisely why this investigation is expanding rather than closing. But I want you to understand something important. The evidence you helped us gather, combined with what we found in that cabin, has given us something Kessler's operation has never faced before. A case built entirely outside the system he corrupted. Federal, ironclad, untouchable by local influence. Ryan, watching Hannah's face, carefully translated Foster's tone as much as her words when he added his own note on the whiteboard beside her. She's saying this can't be stopped now. Too many federal eyes on it. Too much evidence already secured in places Kessler's people can't reach. Hannah read Ryan's addition and felt a small measure of the tension in her chest ease. Though not fully, not while a judge and a district attorney's office, and God knew who else remained named in files she hadn't been allowed to see. She signed a final question, one that had been building since Cole's message that morning. What happens to me now? Am I still in danger? Reyes answered this one directly, his expression grave but honest. Kessler himself is in federal custody with no bail. That threat is neutralized. But some of the officials named in those files are still walking free right now, unaware we know what we know. Once we begin executing warrants against them, which will happen within days, there's a narrow window where a desperate person might do something reckless. I won't pretend that window doesn't exist. But I will tell you this, the security around you isn't going anywhere until every single name in those files has been accounted for. Hannah nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it, and beside her, Cole reached over and squeezed her shoulder, once firm and steady, a silent promise that needed no translation at all. 2 days later, the second wave of raids began, and this time Hannah watched them unfold, not from a place of helpless waiting, inside a hidden pantry room, but from the dining table itself, included fully in every update, as Ryan relayed information in real time, no longer treating her as someone to be shielded from the details, but as someone who had earned the right to witness the case she'd helped build come to its conclusion. Judge Harold Whitfield was arrested at his home just after dawn, led out in handcuffs past a small crowd of stunned neighbors who had known him for 20 years as a pillar of the community. 2 former sheriffs were taken into custody within hours of each other, their properties searched, their bank accounts, frozen pending investigation. And the deputy district attorney, whose name had appeared repeatedly throughout Kessler's financial records, a man named Peter Voss, who had personally overseen 3 previous failed attempts to prosecute Kessler's operations, was arrested at his office in front of his own staff, the irony of his downfall not lost on anyone who'd followed the case. Hannah watched the updates scroll past on Ryan's laptop, watched photographs of each arrest arrive from local news coverage that had exploded across the state within hours, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel amid all the vindication, a strange, hollow kind of sorrow for how long this corruption had been allowed to fester, for how many people before her had likely tried to speak up and been silenced, buried, discredited by the very system meant to protect them. She signed this thought to Ryan, who translated it carefully in his notes. How many people do you think Kessler hurt before me, people who never had a club full of bikers willing to protect them? Ryan read her question, and his expression turned somber before he wrote his response. Too many, probably. That's part of why this matters so much, Hannah. You didn't just save Cole. You gave every one of those earlier victims a chance at justice they never got on their own. Hannah felt tears prick her eyes again. Different this time, not fear, not relief, but something heavier. More complicated grief for strangers she'd never meet, layered beneath gratitude that she'd been given the chance, however dangerous, to help stop it. Across the room, Cole watched her reading Ryan's words, and when she looked up, he crossed to her without needing to be asked, sitting beside her and simply resting a steady hand over hers on the table, an offering of comfort that required no translation whatsoever. It was 3 days after the second wave of arrests that Cole asked to see her alone, away from the constant activity of the ranch house, and Hannah followed him out to the porch where their first real conversation had taken place, where, though neither of them knew it at the time, a hidden camera in the tree line had once captured every quiet, unguarded moment between them. Cole sat on the steps and Hannah settled beside him, noticing immediately that something in his posture had changed, softer, somehow less braced against constant threat, as though for the first time in nearly 2 weeks he'd allowed himself to actually exhale. He pulled out his phone and began typing, and Hannah waited, watching the careful, deliberate way he composed his thoughts before turning the screen toward her. Reyes called this morning. Kessler took a plea deal, full cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing on some charges, though he's still looking at decades behind bars regardless. But here's what matters. His cooperation means every single person he corrupted is going down with him. No trial delays, no drawn-out fight. It's finished, Hannah. Completely and permanently finished. Hannah read the words slowly, letting them settle into her chest, waiting for the relief to fully arrive this time, instead of curdling immediately into fresh dread the way it had after the first wave of arrests. This time it stayed. She felt her shoulders drop, felt weeks of accumulated tension finally begin to release from muscles she hadn't realized were still clenched. And when she looked up at Cole, she found him watching her with an expression she hadn't quite seen from him before, something quieter than gratitude, something that looked almost like wonder. He typed again, slower this time. I've led this club for 11 years. Before that, I rode under 3 other presidents for 20 more. I've seen brothers die. I've buried more friends than I can count. I've faced down rival clubs, corrupt cops, federal indictments that should have ended me. 31 years, Hannah, and I have never once met anyone like you. Hannah felt her throat tighten, and she typed back, her hands trembling slightly. I'm just an art teacher who happened to be driving down the wrong road at the right time. Cole shook his head firmly before he'd even finished reading, and his response came fast, insistent. No, you're the only person in 11 years who ran toward a burning truck without knowing who was inside it. You're the only witness who noticed a dent on a fleeing vehicle that nobody else even registered. You're the reason a 15-year corruption network just collapsed in a matter of weeks. Don't you dare shrink that down to coincidence. Hannah looked at the words for a long moment, feeling something shift inside her chest, a lifetime of learning to make herself smaller, of accepting off the world's tendency to overlook her, slowly rearranging itself into something new, something that dared to take up space. She typed back simply, "Thank you for saying that." Cole reached over and squeezed her hand, and for a while neither of them typed anything at all. They simply sat together on the porch steps in the fading afternoon light, 2 people who had been strangers 3 weeks ago, now bound together by fire and fear, and an unlikely, fierce loyalty that neither of them could have predicted. The formal ceremony happened 4 days later, and Hannah had no idea it was coming until Sarah knocked on her door that evening and with an unusually mysterious smile signed simply, "Get dressed. Something you need to see." Hannah followed her down to the main room and stopped short in the doorway. The room had transformed. Every man and woman she'd come to know over the past 3 weeks stood gathered in a wide circle, Ryan, Sarah, the young man who'd pulled up the traffic camera footage. Dozens of others whose names she'd learned during her time at the ranch, along with faces she didn't recognize. Men who had traveled in from chapters across the state once word had spread of what happened. At the center of the circle stood Cole, dressed not in his usual flannel, but in his full leather vest, freshly cleaned, the patch on the back, now fully visible to her, for the first time a stylized winged skull. The words Hell's Angels arched above it, and beneath it, smaller lettering that read, Montana. He gestured her forward, and Hannah stepped into the circle, her heart pounding, uncertain what was happening, but sensing from the reverent hush that had fallen over the room that this moment mattered deeply to every person present. Cole didn't reach for his phone this time. Instead, Ryan stepped forward beside him, prepared to interpret aloud as Cole spoke, and Hannah watched Cole's throat work once visibly before he began. 31 years I've led men into war." Ryan translated his own voice thick with emotion as he kept pace with Cole's words. I've handed out patches to brothers who bled for this club, who earned their place through years of loyalty and sacrifice. Tonight, for the first time in this club's history, we're doing something we've never done before." Cole nodded to someone at the edge of the circle, and an older man, someone Hannah recognized vaguely as one of the chapter's founding members, stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box. Cole opened it himself, and inside, resting on dark velvet, sat a patch unlike any other Hannah had seen on the vests around her. Smaller, distinct, embroidered with careful precision, a pair of wings wrapped protectively around a single flame. Ryan continued translating as Cole spoke, his voice unsteady now, with barely restrained emotion. "This club doesn't have an honorary membership. We never needed one because nobody outside our brotherhood ever did anything to deserve it. Until now. Hannah Carter didn't ask to become part of this family. She didn't know, my name didn't know what this vest meant, didn't know if I was a good man or a criminal. The world was better off without. She saw a human being trapped in fire, and she risked everything she had to save him." Hannah felt tears sliding down her face, unable to stop them, unwilling to try. "This patch has never existed before tonight." Ryan translated, his own voice cracking slightly. "We designed it for exactly one person, and it will never be given to anyone else. Guardian's Flame. Because Hannah Carter proved that courage doesn't require Caesar's strength or the ability to hear danger coming. It only requires a willingness to run toward it anyway." Cole lifted the patch from its box and stepped closer, and Hannah, through blurred vision, watched him hold it out to her with both hands, the way she imagined men in this world offered things that mattered most. She took it with trembling hands, and the room around her erupted, not into cheers exactly, but into something quieter and more profound. Dozens of hardened, weathered faces openly wiping away tears. Fists pressed briefly to hearts in a gesture Hannah didn't fully understand, but felt instinctively was sacred to the people performing it. Cole stepped forward one final time, and without needing his phone, simply wrapped his arms around her, and Hannah felt the whole room's collected emotion pressing warm against her skin, even though she couldn't hear a single sound of it. Didn't need to, because for the first time in her entire life, she understood completely, and without doubt, that she belonged somewhere fully seen, fully valued, surrounded by people who had chosen her as family, not because they had to, but because she had earned it in fire. "I'm Mary." Later that night, after the ceremony had wound down, and most of the club had dispersed to celebrate more quietly among themselves, Hannah sat alone on the porch again, the small patch resting carefully in her lap, running her fingers over the careful embroidery of the wings and flame. She was so absorbed in the quiet moment that she didn't notice Ryan approaching until he sat down beside her, phone already out. "I wanted to give you something too, if that's all right. Not from the club, from me." Hannah looked up, curious, and nodded. Ryan typed slowly, clearly choosing his words with care. "I've been with this club 15 years. I've watched Cole lead through some of our darkest chapters, but I've never seen him fight for someone the way he fought for you. And I don't just mean protecting you from Kessler. I mean fighting to make sure you never felt small in a room full of people who could hear things you couldn't. That matters more than you probably realize." Hannah felt fresh tears threaten, and she typed back, "It matters to me more than I can explain. I spent my whole life being the person people forgot to include. Nobody here ever made me feel that way. Not once." Ryan smiled, something warm and genuine, and typed his final line before standing to leave her to the quiet night air. "Good, because you're stuck with us now. Family doesn't get uninvited." Hannah watched him walk back inside, and she sat alone for a long while afterward, looking out at the same dark tree line where weeks ago a hidden camera had captured her most vulnerable moments without her knowledge. Now the trees stood empty, unwatched, no longer a source of hidden threat, but simply mountains at rest beneath a wide, indifferent sky. She thought about the $87,000 surgery she still couldn't afford, the balance issues that would eventually worsen. Without it, the ordinary, difficult life waiting for her once this extraordinary chapter finally closed. She thought about returning to her classroom, to her deaf students who relied on her patience and understanding, to the quiet, unremarkable existence she'd been living before a semi-truck crashed into a fuel tanker and changed everything. She didn't know yet that Cole Walker was already, at that very moment, sitting in a back room with Ryan and 3 other senior members discussing something Hannah wouldn't learn about for several more weeks, a plan taking shape not out of pity, not out of simple gratitude, but out of a debt the entire club had collectively decided could never be fully repaid, only honored. She didn't know that within days, quiet phone calls would begin moving through chapters across 17 states that men who had never met her would soon be selling motorcycles they'd owned for decades as tools passed down through generations. Vintage collections and family heirlooms, all without asking for recognition, all simply because word had spread of what a 22-year-old deaf art teacher had done for a man she'd never met. All Hannah knew, sitting on that porch beneath a wide Montana sky with a small embroidered patch resting in her lap, was that for the first time since she was 7 years old, and silence had first closed permanently around her world, she finally understood what it meant to be completely unconditionally seen. The investigation was finished. Victor Kessler and every official he'd corrupted would spend the coming years facing justice long overdue. But Hannah's story, she would soon discover, was far from over, because the people who had become her family were only just beginning to show her exactly how far gratitude could travel when it moved through thousands of hearts at once. 2 weeks after the ceremony, Hannah returned to her small apartment in Missoula, and the ordinariness of it nearly broke something open inside her. The same chipped kitchen counter, the same secondhand furniture, the same view of a parking lot instead of mountains. It felt like stepping back into a life that had belonged to a different person entirely. Someone who hadn't run in a fire, hadn't been hunted, hadn't received a patch that existed for her and no one else. She went back to teaching the following Monday, and her students, a classroom of 11 deaf children, ranging from 6 to 11 years old, greeted her with the kind of unrestrained joy that made her chest ache with gratitude. None of them knew what she'd been through. To them, she was simply Miss Carter, the teacher who understood exactly how they moved through the world, because she moved through it the same way. She hadn't told anyone at the school the full story. A few colleagues had seen the news coverage. The corruption case had made state headlines for nearly a week, though. Hannah's name had been kept out of the official press releases at Reyes's insistence, protecting her privacy even after the danger had passed. But nobody at the school connected quiet, unassuming Hannah Carter to the witness whose testimony had helped topple a 15-year criminal empire. She preferred it that way. She wasn't interested in being known for what happened. She was interested in going back to teaching 7-year-olds how to see color, how to trust their own eyes, the way she'd trusted hers her whole life. But the ache of the surgery she still couldn't afford hadn't gone anywhere. If anything, 3 weeks of stress and adrenaline had worsened the symptoms. She'd noticed herself catching the wall more often lately, a handout for balance where none had been needed a month before, small warning signs that her body was continuing its slow, cruel drift away from stability. She hadn't told Cole or Ryan about the worsening symptoms. She didn't want their gratitude to turn into obligation, didn't want the family that had chosen her to feel burdened by a problem that was ultimately hers alone to solve. She was wrong to think she could hide it from them. She'd forgotten in the quiet return to ordinary life exactly how thoroughly the club paid attention to the people they loved. The call came on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after Hannah had returned home, and when she saw Cole's name light up her phone screen, video call, something they'd started doing regularly since her return, since neither of them wanted the distance of hospital notepads and porch step typing to become the permanent shape of their friendship. She answered immediately, smiling before the call even connected. Cole's face appeared, and Hannah signed a quick greeting, one of the small handful of signs he'd taken the time to learn since she'd left the ranch, determined not to rely entirely on lip reading and written words for the rest of their relationship. He signed back clumsy but recognizable "hello, friend," and Hannah laughed delighted every single time he attempted it. Then his expression shifted, and Hannah felt her stomach tighten reflexively, an old instinct from 3 weeks of constant danger that hadn't fully faded yet. He typed instead of attempting more complex signs, and Hannah read his message as it appeared. "I talked to your doctor's office today. I hope that's okay. I told them I was a family friend helping coordinate your care." Hannah's pulse spiked, and she typed back quickly, a flicker of alarm rising in her chest. "Why would you do that? What's going on?" Cole's response came slower this time, more careful. "Because I noticed you flinch when you stood up too fast last week during our call. Because I know you well enough now to know you'd rather suffer quietly than ask anyone for help. And because your doctor confirmed something you never told me, the degeneration's progressing faster than expected. You need that surgery soon, Hannah. Not eventually. Soon." Hannah felt tears sting her eyes, embarrassment and frustration tangling together in her chest. She typed back, her hands moving fast, defensive. I didn't want anyone to worry. I didn't want the club to feel like they owed me something on top of everything you've already done. You gave me a family. That's more than enough. Cole read her words, and when he responded, his typing had slowed even further, each word placed with obvious deliberation. Hannah, listen to me carefully. This isn't about owing you anything. This was never a debt to be settled and forgotten. You are family now, and family doesn't sit quietly and watch someone they love lose their ability to walk without help because she was too proud to ask for support. Hannah stared at the screen, unable to type anything back for a long moment, her throat too tight around unshed tears. Cole continued, and Hannah watched uncertain as something shifted in his expression, a kind of quiet excitement he seemed to be holding back. I need you to trust me on something. Don't ask questions yet. Just trust me. Can you do that? Hannah wiped her eyes and typed back a small, disbelieving smile, tugging at her mouth despite herself. After everything we've been through together, yes, I trust you completely. Cole smiled, a full, genuine smile Hannah hadn't seen from him. Often weighted usually by exhaustion or grief or grim determination, and typed one final line before ending the call. Good, because something's already in motion, and I think it's going to surprise you. What Hannah didn't know, what Cole had deliberately kept from her, was that the moment he'd hung up from that first call to her doctor's office 3 days earlier, he'd made one more call immediately after to Ryan, and that single conversation had set something enormous into motion across 17 states. It began small, a single post in an internal club forum, visible only to verified members, written by Ryan himself, brothers and sisters. Some of you have heard by now what happened in Montana. The woman who saved Cole's life, who then risked everything to help bring down Victor Kessler's entire operation, needs surgery she can't afford. $87,000. I'm not asking anyone to donate cash directly. I'm asking something different. The post continued, laying out an idea that had come from one of the older members at the Montana chapter, a grizzled veteran named Big Tom who had spent 40 years building a personal collection of vintage motorcycles restored by hand over decades of patient, obsessive work. Big Tom had been the first to respond publicly to Ryan's post. I've got a 1948 Panhead I've been holding on to for 30 years. Never rode it once the last decade, just sat in my garage looking pretty. It's worth more to that girl than it's ever been worth to me. Selling it, every dollar goes to her surgery. Within hours, other responses began pouring in from chapters Hannah had never heard of, from men and women who had never met her, who knew her only through the story that had spread quietly at first, then like wildfire through the club's tight-knit network. A woman in Oregon offered a complete set of hand-tooled leather saddlebags custom-made by her late husband, worth several $1,000s to serious collectors. A chapter in Arizona pulled together and offered an entire vintage Harley they jointly restored over 3 years as a club project, intending originally to raffle it among themselves. A man in Pennsylvania offered his grandfather's original 1952 Indian Chief, a bike so rare that specialized collectors had offered him 6 figures for it over the years, offers he'd always refused until now. Ryan tracked every single pledge in a shared document, watching numbers climb through the following days with a disbelief that eventually gave way to quiet, overwhelmed awe. Nobody organized a public fundraiser. Nobody sought media attention. There was no GoFundMe page, no press release, no photo opportunity designed to make anyone look generous. It was as Cole had insisted from the very beginning, simply thousands of quiet acts of gratitude moving through a family that took care of its own without ever needing an audience to witness it. By the end of the first week, the pledge total had already crossed $50,000. By the end of the second week, it had passed 90. Hannah had no idea any of this was happening. She continued, teaching continued her quiet evenings alone in her apartment, continued noticing with growing private fear she still hadn't shared with anyone the small but undeniable signs that her balance was worsening. She'd started keeping a hand on the wall when she walked to her bathroom at night. She'd stopped trusting herself on stairs without gripping the railing tightly. She hadn't heard from Cole in 4 days, which struck her as unusual given how consistently he'd been checking in since her return home, and she found herself worrying an old habit, checking in on the people she cared about, a habit that had only intensified after everything they'd survived together. When her phone finally rang on a Friday evening, she answered immediately, a relief washing through her at the sight of Cole's name on the screen. His face appeared, and Hannah immediately noticed something different in his expression, a barely contained excitement. He seemed to be fighting to keep controlled. He signed "Hello, friend" again, his clumsy attempt still making her smile every time, and then he typed quickly, "Are you free tomorrow? I want to come see you in person. I have something to show you." Hannah typed back curious, "Of course, is everything okay?" Cole's response came with what looked even through the small phone screen like barely restrained joy. "Everything is more than okay. Just trust me. Remember tomorrow, 2 o'clock." Cole arrived exactly at 2 the following afternoon, and Hannah opened her apartment door to find him standing in the hallway, Ryan beside him. Both men dressed casually but wearing expressions that told her immediately that whatever they'd come to tell her mattered enormously to both of them. She invited them in, gestured toward her small kitchen table, and the moment they sat, Cole slid his laptop across the surface toward her, already open to a document Hannah didn't recognize. He typed on his phone while she read, "Before you look at the numbers, I need you to understand something. Nobody did this because they felt sorry for you. Nobody did this to settle a debt. They did this because your story reached people you've never met and it changed something in them. That matters more than the money itself." Hannah looked up at him confused, then back down at the laptop screen, and her breath caught completely in her chest. The document was a running total donation after donation, item after item. Each entry logged with a name, a chapter, a brief note. Motorcycles, tools, leather goods, artwork, vintage collectibles accumulated over decades of careful, patient collecting. Family heirlooms that clearly carried enormous personal weight offered without hesitation by people whose names meant nothing to her, but whose generosity, item by item, entry by entry, had built into something staggering. At the bottom of the document, a final total sat highlighted in bold. $104,612. Hannah stared at the number, certain she'd misread it, certain there had to be some mistake. And when she looked up at Cole and Ryan, both men were watching her with tears already gathering in their eyes, waiting for her reaction. She typed with shaking hands, "This can't be real. I don't understand. How did this happen?" Ryan answered this time, taking the laptop gently and typing his response with visible emotion. "It started with Big Tom's motorcycle. Then it just kept growing. 17 states, Hannah. Chapters that have never even met you, who only know your name from a story that spread faster than any of us expected. Every single dollar came from someone selling something that mattered to them personally because your story mattered to them more." Hannah felt tears spilling freely now, unable to stop them, unable to process the sheer scale of what these strangers had done for her. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but out of something Cole had tried to explain to her weeks ago on that porch step, something she was only now beginning to fully understand. She typed barely legible through her shaking hands, "This covers the surgery, all of it, and more." Cole nodded, wiping his own face without embarrassment, and typed his response slowly, deliberately, the way he always did when something mattered too much to rush. "It covers the surgery, the recovery, physical therapy, and enough left over that you never have to worry about affording your own safety again. You risked your life for a stranger on a highway, Hannah, expecting nothing in return. This isn't repayment. There's no such thing as repayment for what you did. This is just what family does when one of their own needs help. Nothing more complicated than that." Hannah set the laptop down, her hands still trembling, and looked between the two men who had become, in the space of a single terrifying month, more important to her than she could have imagined possible. She signed slow and deliberate, wanting them both to see it clearly without needing translation. "Thank you. Not just for this, for seeing me, for making me feel like I mattered when for so long I felt invisible." Cole crossed the small kitchen and pulled her into a tight embrace, and Ryan joined a moment later, the three of them standing together in Hannah's small apartment, bound by something far stronger than the chance circumstances that had first brought them together on a burning Montana highway. The surgery took place 6 weeks later at a specialized surgical center in Seattle, known for its expertise in complex vestibular procedures, and Hannah went into the operating room with a strength she hadn't known she possessed a month earlier. Not because the fear had disappeared, but because, for the first time in her adult life, she wasn't facing something frightening entirely alone. Cole and Ryan had both traveled to Seattle for the procedure along with Sarah, who had become over the preceding weeks one of Hannah's closest friends. The three of them sat in the surgical waiting room for 6 hours, and though Hannah couldn't witness their vigil herself, she would later learn from Sarah that Cole hadn't sat down once during the entire procedure, pacing the small waiting area with the same restless protective energy he'd shown the night Kessler's men approached the ranch. The surgery was a success. Hannah woke in recovery with her vision blurred, her body heavy with anesthesia, and the first thing she saw clearly, once her eyes finally focused, was Cole's face hovering close, his relief so profound it looked almost like grief. He signed slowly, carefully, using every sign he had painstakingly learned over the preceding weeks specifically for this moment. Okay. Hannah managed a weak, exhausted smile and signed back her hands, clumsy with lingering sedation. I'm okay. Thank you. Cole's eyes filled with tears he didn't bother hiding, and he pressed his forehead gently against her hand, and Hannah felt, even through the haze of anesthesia, the full weight of everything this moment represented. Not just a successful surgery, not just a life-changing medical procedure, finally within reach after years of impossible hope, but the culmination of an unlikely, fierce love between people who had started as complete strangers and become, through fire and fear and unwavering loyalty, something far deeper than either of them could have predicted. Recovery took months, but Hannah's progress exceeded even her doctor's most optimistic projections. Physical therapy, initially exhausting and frustrating, gradually rebuilt strength and stability she'd spent years slowly losing. By early spring, 6 months after the surgery, Hannah walked without a cane for the first time in nearly 2 years, crossing her therapist's office under her own power, balanced and steady. Tears of disbelieving joy streaming down her face as her physical therapist applauded from across the room. She called Cole the moment she left the appointment video, connecting almost instantly, and when he saw her actually walking steady and sure, holding the phone at arm's length to show him the empty space where a cane used to be, his reaction was everything Hannah could have hoped for, and more, his face breaking into open, unguarded joy that needed no translation whatsoever. She returned to teaching that same week, and her students noticed immediately, delighted by the change in their teacher's confident, steady movements around the classroom, though none of them fully understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Hannah found herself more and more often pausing during ordinary moments, walking down a hallway, climbing stairs without gripping the railing, simply standing steady and balanced in a doorway, to marvel quietly at a body she'd once feared losing entirely. But the changes in Hannah's life extended far beyond physical recovery. She began with Cole's encouragement, working alongside a disability advocacy organization, using her own experience, both the accident and its aftermath, to push for better accessibility standards in emergency medical response, better training for first responders working with deaf and hard of hearing patients, better representation for disabled witnesses navigating a legal system that too often dismissed their observations as less credible. Her advocacy work brought her 18 months after the highway fire that had started everything to a small ceremony in Missoula that Hannah herself had helped organize, the unveiling of a permanent memorial along Route 93 close to the site of the crash, dedicated not to Cole, not to the club, but to every emergency responder and ordinary bystander who had ever risked their own safety for a stranger. Cole stood beside her during the unveiling, along with dozens of club members who had traveled in for the occasion, and when local reporters asked Hannah through an interpreter what had inspired the memorial, her answer was simple and unwavering. I didn't save a biker that day. She signed, her words translated aloud for the small gathered crowd. I saved a person. Everyone deserves that chance to be seen as a person first, whether they're wearing a leather vest or a hospital gown or nothing that marks them as belonging anywhere at all. That's what this memorial represents. Not one act of courage. Every act of courage from anyone willing to run toward danger instead of away from it. 2 years after the highway fire and the exact anniversary of the crash, Hannah stood once again at that same roadside memorial, but this time she wasn't alone, and she wasn't there for a formal ceremony with reporters and prepared statements. She stood surrounded by nearly 300 motorcycles, their riders gathered quietly in the early morning. Light engines. Silent heads bowed, not in mourning, but in a solemn kind of gratitude that had become, in just 2 short years, an annual tradition. Nobody had officially declared, but everyone understood completely. Cole stood beside her, his hair a little grayer now, though his presence remained as steady and grounding as it had been from the very first moment Hannah had dragged him from beneath a burning truck without knowing his name. He signed to her his fluency far beyond the clumsy attempts of 2 years earlier, having spent considerable time in the intervening months actually learning proper ASL, rather than relying solely on written words between them. Every year we'll be here. As long as I'm breathing, and long after that too, because I've made sure the club understands why this matters. Hannah signed back, smiling despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I know. I never doubted it. Around them, 300 riders stood in respectful silence, honoring not the national president of a motorcycle club whose reputation preceded him across 17 states, but a 22-year-old deaf art teacher who had once believed before that terrible and transformative day that she would always be the person the world forgot to notice. She was never forgotten again. Hannah Carter had walked into fire not knowing who she was saving, only knowing that a life was worth more than her own safety. And in doing so, she had uncovered a corruption network that had poisoned an entire region for 15 years, had given voice to victims who never had the chance to speak for themselves, and had found in the most unlikely family imaginable the one thing she had spent her whole life quietly aching for: a place where she was never invisible, never overlooked, never anything less than completely and unconditionally seen. The memorial stood permanently along that Montana highway, a simple stone marker bearing no elaborate inscription, only a single line that Hannah herself had chosen words that captured everything this extraordinary journey had ultimately proven true. Real courage asks no questions about who deserves to be saved. It simply chooses to run toward the fire. And every single year on that same quiet morning, 300 engines fell silent to honor exactly that.